I'll often find I've recorded either a mono synth source or only have one good mic in a session, and after the fact, I'll want something a little more stereo. So I wanted to share a few of the approaches I've tried for generating natural sounding stereo images, starting with the least practical and ending on the ones that I use most frequently. For example sounds, we've got this mono synth wub, and also some metal handling. As you can tell, both by looking at the waveforms and the stereoscope over here, they're straight up the center. And I'm also going to be using this Brainworks BX Control V2 to solo the sides, because for a lot of these plugins, it helps to just hear what the difference is between the channels, so you can diagnose whether, just like what they're actually doing. So the first one I want to take a look at is this Scheops Upmix plugin, because I was under the impression this was the exact application for this sort of tool. And if we take a listen. No knocks against the developers on this one, and maybe it's better for other purposes, but for me, it really just sounds like it's adding a slapback reverb, like a very short early reflection, even if you tone it down. Yeah, just not really that great. We can solo the sides to hear exactly what it's doing. And yeah, it's just this like super out of phase. It just sounds like it's putting the sound in a bathroom, to be honest. So sorry, that one, I tried it and saved you the purchase there. It's not really that great. Next up is Microshift. We hear that. You can probably tell just by those two examples, it works fine on synth content that's a little more stylized. Basically, it sounds like it's adding a little bit of a delay with some modulation to it, which is kind of fundamentally what all these are doing. But it really sounds unnatural on any sort of real-world recording, especially ones that have transients, like this recording. I find that style 2 is the best out of all of them, and when you bring the delays down to tight to bring the timing in a little bit and just like mix it down a bit, it's okay. We can listen to just the side signal. It's like, it's fine, I guess, but it's just, I don't know. To me, you can hear the actual delay happening, which sort of ruins the effect. Again, it's fine for synth stuff where you can get away with a little bit more synthetic processing, but I often find that like something like this metal recording really puts into the test. And to me, it doesn't really cut the mustard there. Taking a look at serum effects, really I'm only interested in the hyperdimension part of this one. By default, I think it has the dimension turned down, just the hyper up a little bit. And it's like, it's surprisingly fine. It's kind of subtle if we listen to the synth one. Again, with synthetic stuff, I think it sounds perfectly acceptable. It really just sounds like you added like more oscillators to the voice, which is great. But with the Foley stuff, you can hear some of that like liquid flanging or phasing going on. That just makes the modulation really apparent in an unpleasing way. If we listen to just the side signal again, that's what the hyper sounds like. That's what the dimension sounds like. I'm not exactly sure what they're doing, but the dimension sounds almost like a diffused little delay with a very tight timing. So like you can, if you mix in both of them, just like a slight amount, just to give a little bit of stereo image, it can be fine. But yeah, it's pretty fiddly, and I would really only use this for synth stuff personally. Then the next one I want to look at is Timeless 3, specifically using the thick, slightly phased chorus BM preset. This one, it had like some other effects that I've turned off. The diffusion's okay, and I've turned down the mix to about like 45%, but you can give that a listen. This one's also like perfectly acceptable. I find that it's actually on the subtler side. We can, again, just monitor the sides. Especially on the synth stuff with it in isolation, you can hear like the rapid modulation happening. But honestly, with the dry signal mixed in, it's fine. You can also get away with this one. I'll talk about this more later, but using additional processes afterwards to bump up the stereo image a little bit more and enhance it makes this technique go a lot further. Then taking a look at BX Stereomaker. This one's also pretty smooth. I have the stereo expansion only turned up to 43%. I think by default, it's at 100%. It's more like this. And you can sort of hear the delays there a little bit more clearly, again with the sides. It's the smoothest so far to my ears, but I usually like to tone it down just a bit if I'm going to use this one. And this one actually has some additional controls where you can like change the tone, which you can definitely hear the effect. I'm not exactly sure how this one works, but I would assume that this is like the frequency center around where it's doing its processing, and also has like mono frequency, which is basically saying, you know, the typical stuff where below this frequency don't apply the stereo expansion, which can be pretty nice because usually like below 100 hertz or so, you don't want that to be too stereo. At this point, I would say these last few generally come down to personal preference and specific use cases. Next, taking a look at DearVR Pro. This is an application that I didn't originally purchase this plugin for, and maybe it wasn't originally intended for, but I find it actually does a pretty convincing mono upmix. If you set the azimuth to 0, again, elevation to 0 and distance to just like a fraction of a meter, or whatever that unit is, yeah, just taking a look from the side view as well, it's pretty much right on top of where the listener is. It does this. And it's not immediately clear, but if I just solo the sides, you can tell that it's basically just taking the high frequency detail and widening that up a bit. I don't know exactly how the algorithm works, but that's sort of the effect to my ears. And it's not too bad. If you turn on the reflections, it starts sounding more like what Scheops was doing, which I don't really prefer. Same thing with the reverb, it just has reverb. I think those are great for some of the other applications that this plugin was probably intended for, but for this one specifically, I like to leave those off. And finally, we get to the one that I actually use most often, and that's purely because it's just the simplest and quickest. It might not sound the cleanest, but it's good enough for 90% of the cases that I reach for these. That's the Khz Chorus. We can hear that in action. This is typically how I'll set it, with the delay around 4 milliseconds. There's the depth, the rate, I think those are just default. I'll crank the spread down a little bit and the mix about 35, and the mix is what I'll adjust to taste. A little bit more, and you can really hear the sort of like delay artifacts going on there. So just around 35 or even a touch more. I think sounds pretty good for most use cases. If we take a listen to just the side signal there, the modulation and the movement is super obvious, but again, with synth content, it's usually fine to hear that. And I find that even with like real recordings, it just blends in a pleasing way. So using any one of those processors as a starting point, I'll often add something a little extra after it to give me something a little bit wider if I need extra width or even just more flavor after the fact. So starting off, we got Pro Q here. I'm going to take a band and set it to only affect the side channels and turn it into the tilt function. Tilt curve. And if you just boost it up a little bit, what that'll do is increase the high frequency content in the difference between the two channels, left and right, which is the side, right? And then reduce the low frequency content there, which is usually how I want the sides to be shaped anyways, as this effect. Without it. You can go to real extremes with this too. In a similar way, you can reach for Saturn to basically just affect the side signals. If you switch it to MS mode, then turn the pan knob to all the way to the side, then, I don't know, pick something a little bit more present like warm tube and turn up the drive a bit. This last one is a similar approach to how we sculpted the frequency content using Pro Q, but instead of just doing straight up EQ increasements, we're doing different types of compression. This is applying downwards compression to the mids and upwards compression to the sides. To get this working, you have to click inside a band on the stereo link section. You can tell it to listen either to the mids or the sides. By default, it's going to be 100%. You can turn it to do side only or mid only here. And you can see the little nodes here change to an M and an S to show that they're only affecting the mids and the sides. And then taking a listen to that. It's pretty subtle again, but also pretty natural. This is, we have the range set to a positive amount and the threshold set to negative. So it's doing upwards compression and then, yeah, doing downwards compression over here. It's just a different approach if maybe you weren't getting what you wanted from just the tilt shift using Pro Q3.